Sorry, I just had to, do an intro real quick.
Who is he?
Hold on, pause this shit. What the fuck is going on in here on this day?
I hope you enjoyed my intro. I just had the idea. I also wanted to show you guys that I'm not just all talk. I make art. I'm not just some freak. I was trying to write this script, this outline, and honestly,
It was
really rough. Many of you know Vanessa.
Vanessa.
On my birthday of all days, a few weeks ago, Vanessa released this video called "This is Why the Trans Community Isn't Respected, RANT." And in this video, there's a lot to unpack here because not only is it an 18-minute video that is clouded with all the rhetoric, there are no valid arguments, no cited sources or evidence, and there's just a whole lot of misinformation or manipulation of the facts. So Vanessa, basically, I have a lot to say about this video. Surprise, surprise. Hopefully you stick and watch the whole video because I'm not just going to break down all the points. I'm actually going to get to the heart of the video and discuss why this video and her channel specifically is so hurtful to the trans community and so toxic. I feel like you should stick around to get the whole thing, the full effect. Hopefully this time it'll still be fun. It'll still be quirky. Yeah. But I'll also be a structured business professional in case, for instance, Vanessa sees this. The structure of Vanessa's video is non-existent, which is fine because it's a rant video, so she can do whatever the fuck she wants. But she failed to consider that some random trans fucker might want to make a rebuttal video, and it's going to be super fucking hard for me now because I'm gonna have to structure the video, and I don't.
That's fine.
Rather than just go in chronological order and jump from topic to topic like Vanessa does whenever she decides she just wants to make a point, I'm going to do my best to group the topics at hand. I'm going to include the quotes and videos of her saying these things with a timestamp and everything. So if you just decide that you want to go on her channel and watch it just to make sure she's in context or whatever,
You can do that.
my goal isn't to take anything she says out of context. So here's some context. Vanessa is a right-wing trans YouTuber known for her hit videos like "Trans Predators Are Everywhere." Joanne is actually not a bad person. "Trump is my kawaii daddy." And other hits like "Other trans people aren't trans because I don't like them."
You're the one that said that I was erasing you as trans. I am. You're not trans. There's
Lying.
Watch these great videos for more specific instances of Vanessa's lies.
Voting for Trump both times. And just being an overall grifter. You might think this all sounds
Biased.
but I hope that by seeing that what she's saying in this video, you'll be able to understand all of these things that I've mentioned. You'll be able to see how they're true of her just in this one video. And this video is actually just basically a thesis on Vanessa's entire channel and her YouTube history, because she usually uses her platform as a place to pander to a base of primarily right-wingers, transphobic people, and transgender people who just, I don't know, are trans people with internalized transphobia. If you watch Blaire's video, you can see a lot of that, I think, in any of her videos about her. Not that she doesn't think that she's a beautiful, gorgeous woman, but there's a lot to unpack there as well. But we're not going to do that today. And while many of us have continued to make videos and call her out and try to educate her, she doubles down and refuses to even add a hint of nuance to her channel and to her videos. So this video is going to be long, probably pretty long, but I think it's worth that you stay and watch the whole thing because she says a lot of things that she expects you to just take at face value, which is really dangerous because most of the things she says are not true or they're manipulations of the English language. Yeah, so without further ado, Blaire's gay agenda. So a major point that Blaire wants to make in this video, and the one that she starts off with, is that gay people's agenda was really good and successful at getting equality, and they didn't have to lie to get acceptance, and it was really good branding on their part. So I'm going to go point by point. So she starts off the video talking about this debate on the Dr. Phil show and how people don't debate gay marriage anymore. Like, it's like accepted now.
Now I feel like it's very difficult to find even two people to sit in a room and really like debate that issue with passion. I don't feel like trans issues, at least in the foreseeable future, are going to ever reach that level of like nonchalant discussion.
Maybe Blaire's unaware of this, but seeing as she was born in 1993 and started her transition in 2015, the year gay people were able to marry legally in the United States, I'll give her a pass. But basically, for the entirety of American history, queer people have been extremely oppressed. And while gay people have come a long way, it hasn't been an easy fight. In fact, the gay rights movement, along with the trans movement, didn't have any momentum until the 1969 Stonewall riots. Until like basically a week or two ago, you could still legally discriminate against gay people in unemployment, housing, public education, federal funding, etc. in 21 states, different degrees. And you could still discriminate against trans people in varying degrees in 38 states. Hey, so editing Clark here. I didn't realize the Equality Act has only been passed in the House and not the Senate. So technically it is still legal in those states I mentioned to discriminate against LGBT people. And there's a possibility that it will not pass in the Senate and that you will be able to continue to discriminate against us. So yeah, I just wanted to clear that up. While she's right in saying that most of the population does not give a shit about gay people's right to get married, don't forget that if we're starting just at Stonewall, it has taken 52 years to get where we are today. And there are still battles to be fought, not only for trans rights, but for gay rights as well. She says that gay people didn't have to lie. You know, they just said, we just wanted to be included in society, whether it's marriage or adoption. And that was like fine enough and got them their rights. They didn't have any of this weird other bullshit that trans people have to say to get accepted.
Messaging of the trans community is so off. The gay rights movement had very great messaging and it was branded very well, and it changed minds because everything the gay rights movement sort of argued was both true and was easy to get behind. The argument from the gay rights movement was very much, we are normal people just like you, we are just maybe born a little different and we want to be included in society, whether it's adoption, gay marriage, etc.
I don't know if Vanessa knows this, but up until 2003 it was still legal for states to have basically anti-gay laws, sodomy laws, criminalize homosexuality. Literally from the inception of the Bill of Rights until 1963, every state had sodomy laws. It was literally illegal to be gay in every state until 1963. And even then, most states probably still had them. And slowly up until 2003, it was made federally illegal to have sodomy laws. So she's talking about the gay rights movement, like the only things that have happened in it were from like 2005 with Brokeback Mountain up until 2015 when gay marriage was legalized. And doing that is extremely reductive and doesn't paint a full picture of the trials and tribulations of gay people, especially Black and Indigenous people of color who were gay. So, and those are still a lot of intersections that are more complicated than people like white gays have to deal with. And all this talk of
branding.
She should know that the original cry of the gay community was,
hi, don't hurt us and don't attack us. Please just leave us alone.
It wasn't, hey, we want to get married. It was literally just like, don't beat us up. And then especially with the AIDS crisis, the message became that gay people need to come out of the closet, because if everyone knew a gay person, you would know that gay people are just people. And especially, this is something that's different than with something like, you know, Black liberation, is that gay people come from every single cultural and socioeconomic background. Gay people are literally everywhere. That's also one of the reasons that the gay rights movement was able to get so much momentum so quickly. Also, side note, 67% of polled Americans in 2020 believe that gay people should have the right to get married. So when we're talking about trans issues, there was indeed a poll in 2019 that actually found that 62% of Americans thought trans people should have rights. And that's pretty close to the current gay approval rating, Vanessa, if you wanted to know.
That's a surprise tool that can help us
Okay, so then she says the gay rights movement didn't have to tell any lies to gain acceptance. They told the truth, and the truth always wins.
Gay rights movement didn't have to tell any lies to gain acceptance. They simply had to tell the truth because the truth always wins.
It took 46 years for gay marriage to be legalized and 52 years to get legal protections from discrimination for gay people. So there is no line saying that trans people deserve the same legal rights and protections as everyone else. They also deserve access to life-saving medical care, i.e. access to medical transition if they need it. And the fact that Blaire is trying to paint this negative, reductive picture of the trans community for her own personal gain without thinking about the consequences to the community, like herself and her friends included, it's very disgusting. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but that was after me writing this for a while, like,
oh my God, can you
stop bumping the microphone
section. So that's how she talks about gay people. It's just reductive, and it's kind of stupid to be making this whole argument on the basis of like the gay rights movement when the gay rights movement had to fight against like so much. Next section is Blaire's cisnormative life. So Blaire's next point, in conjunction with the last topic of gay people, she thinks assimilation is key, and that us, the trans community, should strive for assimilation rather than revolution.
It was a message of a desire for assimilation rather than deconstructing society to fit around the gay community.
Because apparently she thinks gay people assimilated, and that was great, which there's a lot to talk about here. So this is about assimilation. The most common cultural change when two cultures compete is assimilation of the minority culture into the majority culture. The minority culture gradually loses all of the markers that set it apart as a separate culture in the first place. Markers include things like languages, food, and customs. Eventually, the minority culture becomes almost indistinguishable from the majority culture. That is the definition of assimilation. And why is Blaire talking about this like it's a good thing? If you were to talk to any person from any minority culture in America, especially indigenous cultures all over the world even, colonialism is a worldwide problem, not just America. But if you were to talk to anyone in any minority culture, they would tell you that is in fact a very violent process that strips a culture from all of its meaning and uniqueness. And that has happened to many, if not all, white queer people over time, and this is its own issue in society, as now white queers can play pretend and fit in with the majority of cishet culture, but they are not only robbed of their queer roots, it also pushes Black Indigenous POC further into the edges of society, as it continues the white supremacist ideal that in order to succeed in America, you have to get as close to white cishet Christian man, and the further you are from this, the worse off you're going to have it in society. That is just how our society runs. It is not good. It is not moral. It's not what we should be upholding. And the fact is that assimilation upholds this value because it says, lose everything that makes you unique about yourself and your culture and your community, and try your best to get as close to this golden standard that we've set. And the fact is that if you're not white, you're just such a farther disadvantage. Not to say that that's good and that you should be, but that's how our culture is. That's how our society was made. The white gay men can just tone down their gayness and just pretend. I'm just like the straight man, except I have a husband instead of a wife. That breaking up of the queer community, of the gay community, it further marginalizes Black and Indigenous POC that are gay because it says that there's a separation, and assimilation has enabled that separation. And that is not a good thing, Blaire. Just because you think the gay community still has, there's still a gay community. Have you ever seen RuPaul's Drag Race? Yes, Blaire, we all have. That is good that that's mainstream, but at the same time, what are the costs of assimilation? Moving on from that, Blaire is a real doll. The dolls. This is about this idea of real life, and you'll come to see what I mean by that. Another thing that comes up with this idea that trans people and other queer should assimilate and pretend to be cis and whatever is the idea that anyone who doesn't assimilate is delusional and doesn't actually live in the real world, like Vanessa or someone like Corbin. Corvette. Garage. So she says, everyday normal regular people.
When everyday normal regular people hear things like,
meaning cis people. Girl, I swear to God. I swear, Vanessa. Both you and Calvin Garbage pretend like the internet isn't real life, and that people who use the internet don't also live in real life. I have news for you, Vanessa. Just like you, trans people are also everyday, normal, regular people. Not all of us are. Okay. Remember my first video? Well, you can't be cis. You're covered in tattoos. You can't be cis. You're bald. Blaire then goes to say, not any trans people in my real life and online discourse, fight for your rights type of crowd.
And me, not any trans people I know in my real life, but the online discourse, trans activist, fight for your rights type of crowd.
Fight for your rights type of crowd. Do you not want rights?
She says that trans people confine themselves to trans communities online in their own echo chambers and then get shocked when people outside push against them.
Trans people online very much confine themselves into an echo chamber of just trans ideology. Their arguments make sense to everyone in their circle, but then they act so shocked when people push against it so hard from the outside.
When you start to get older and live in the real world, basically you outgrow that and you learn to just like shut up and assimilate.
When you start to get a little older and you start to actually like assimilate into society, you realize a lot of these arguments just don't hold up.
So trans people, especially Black, Indigenous, POC, trans women, have such an increase of violence and rejection to face in their lives that of course all trans people should have access to safe spaces online where they engage in discourse just like every other community. But what Vanessa fails to realize is that trans people exist in the real world. Trans people go to school. Trans people go to work. Trans people go to the grocery store. They go to the fucking gas station.
Okay.
They have neighbors. They have friends. They have family. All in the real world. This is all happening outside of the online space. And trans people tend to know exactly how the outside world perceives them and treats them. We face it every day. For some people, like Vanessa, they're cis-assuming. That means people just assume they're cis by what they look like. That way it doesn't put the onus on them for being cis-passing, because some trans people don't want to be cis-passing. People just assume they're cis. And they don't give a fuck. They can still face problems like in dating or making friends with cis people, or if people who they don't wish to tell them that they're trans become aware of their trans status. That can be dangerous, but that's just life as a trans person in the real world. Other people like me are visibly queer, visibly something else. People misgender me constantly.
Constantly.
I get some F slurs and some D slurs thrown my way. That's just how it is. I don't really care. In fact, the more confused you look when you're looking at me on the train, like, it's very affirming, honestly, when someone looks at me like, and you can tell they're trying to like decide. That's pretty fun. And the point that I'm making is, well, yes, trans people seek comfort and familiarity online. We also all literally live in the real world. And while we don't have to have these like conversations every day, I certainly talk about these issues in person with my cis friends and colleagues when it's appropriate. And I don't expect them to have the same like ideas of gender and sex as I do. But over time, as they engage and talk with me and listening to me, their thinking will likely evolve over time, also to include how they see their own gender and sex and sexuality. And I know that's not the case with everyone, but as someone who does live in the real world, Vanessa, I can tell you that the majority of people also just don't give a fuck. They don't care. Or they'll listen to me if I have anything to say. Also, Vanessa likes to talk about the real world as if she's not a conservative, cis-assuming, straight white person. To be fair, Vanessa, most trans people's lives don't look like yours either. Vanessa had the means and the privilege of being able to get on hormones and get surgery at a relatively young age, which is not the case for many trans people. Hey, so I'm back again. I just wanted to real quick mention, like, I'm not trying to shame Blaire for, like, being able to transition, and I'm not trying to shame any trans person for being, like, having the means to transition, like, when others don't. Like, that's not fair. I just wanted to emphasize, like, how much privilege Blaire has, like, in the trans community. I just wanted to mention, like, you know, not everyone has the same means and can do the same thing, including myself. So, okay. Bye. Next section. Blaire's anti-trans fan club. So Vanessa, like I mentioned earlier, is known for her
Conservative talking points.
and her internalized and I guess externalized transphobia. She specifically mentions 2 major anti-trans talking points in this video and continues to just like spread it and misinformation like wildfire and hatred like wildfire in this video and on our channel. And because of that, I will be breaking down both of these points that she's mentioned. So buckle up. This part gets a little hairy, if I say so myself. So the first talking point that she brings up a lot in this video is sports. Oh my god. She says that trans activists, we're saying there is no difference between biological women and trans women in sports. And the realities of sexual dimorphism are in all species but humans now.
They're insisting, no, there's no difference between a trans woman and a biological woman when they're competing in sports. The realities of sexual dimorphism have been, it's in what? It's supposed to be in every species but humans now?
Well, Blaire, I'll tell you, I looked into it, okay? First of all, the language. She says biological women in juxtaposition to trans women, and that's very evil to me. It's here that we must remember that Vanessa, is a conservative talking head with an audience that expects a certain rhetoric, and that she must please. And by saying things like this, she's giving away the underlying idea that trans women are not real women because they aren't biological women. That's what that means. She's saying these are biological women and then trans women. It's very, I think, apparent and disgusting what she's saying. And you know what? Part of that might just be her own internalized transphobia, but it's also making it available for cis people to be transphobic by using that language. So anyway, secondly, let's discuss what sexual dimorphism is, because it's a term that simply means, and I quote, a distinct difference in size or appearance between the sexes of an animal in addition to difference between the sexual organs themselves. And in fact, humans actually exhibit very, very low levels of sexual dimorphism compared to other animals. Which is what this all is. And despite this, the sexual characteristics, they vary species to species. So not all species have like a male with testes and fucking sperm or whatever, and not all females have like the eggs and the other shit. It's a really weird thing to be saying, because sexual dimorphism literally just means any differences. And in fact, like I said, humans just don't really have that many differences. Also, while these terms are real and they're used to describe real things that we observe in nature and biology, these are still just ideas and constructs that we as humans came up with. And when we talk about human society versus all other animals, we're the only species with such a complex societal structure to also take into account when talking about issues of social constructs, marginalization, and discrimination. She's throwing out buzzwords, scientific buzzwords, and she's really being obtuse about it. I also want to take this time to just say that I learned about the ribbon eel and how all ribbon eels are born male, and as they mature, they develop into females with female sexual characteristics. So every ribbon eel will both father and mother more ribbon eels. That is just maybe one small example of this thing. She says, so like 99% of animals are sexually dimorphic except for humans.
99.9% of the animal kingdom, males and females are different, but not in humans.
She literally has no idea what she's saying. Vanessa, stop talking. As once again, in terms of all of the animal kingdom, humans are some of the least sexually dimorphic animals. Some examples of more extremely sexually dimorphic animals are anglerfish. Anglerfish females are the big scary nightlights that are literally 1 feet long. And the males are parasitic half-inch little fuckers. They literally parasite attach themselves onto the female in order to reproduce. And then they die very quickly. So that gives you a big idea of what sexual dimorphism is. Male peacocks have the big, beautiful train of feathers that you all think about when you think of peacocks. While peahens, they're like brown and boring, and they don't have like a big train of feathers. They're just kind of like, they still have feathers, but not like a huge train like the males. So that's another example. Literally one is blue, vibrant, and huge and beautiful, and the other is like small, brown, and kind of ugly. Sorry, peahens.
I'm just saying.
Lions, that's a really good example. Males have the big, huge, luscious manes, and they like loudly roar to signify whatever lions have to signify. And at the same time, female lions, they don't have that, and they don't like yell as much. But female lions in some like specific populations of lions have been known to adopt male roles in their lion society. And when they do that, they will literally start to grow a mane and roar like the males, and even occasionally attempt to literally mount other females. Gay lions. they will literally become more biologically characteristic of males. So also, if you were to look at humans objectively, there's basically only one big difference between literally every human, between the sexes at least, and that's genitalia. Otherwise, the overall shapes, colors, and hair patterns can be found among both sexes. The hormone levels between sexes can fluctuate wildly person to person. Some males have less testosterone, maybe closer to a female range, and vice versa. Like literally down to the tissue of the genitalia is basically the same. And if you're going to say something like boobies, well, guess what men who are a little bit larger have? They have boobies. They have them.
This is not to say that there are not real differences between the functions or needs of different bodies, but the point I'm making is that the human species is so similar within itself, and yet also so unique and complex. While all humans are made of the same basic parts and structures, we all function and exist uniquely. No one human runs exact to any other, and it is one of the great beauties of living as a part of the human race.
So compared to literally all animals, the differences aren't really as big as you maybe think that they are, Vanessa. Next, she says, these trans women are demolishing these female athletes.
Those trans women really are demolishing those female athletes in every single competition.
I've got a lot to say about this. So first, let's mention that Vanessa does not provide any evidence or examples or sources. All she has is an anecdote that I'm inclined to believe is not real, purely based on her history of distorting reality to fit her agenda. Next, let me take you on a mini journey. In the early 70s, a trans woman named Renee Richards is in a Supreme Court battle because she's a tennis player who was gradually moving up the ranks of tennis, and she was invited to play in the US Open, but they required her to submit a chromosome test to verify her sex, and she refused, and she took them to court, and in 1977, the Supreme Court actually ruled in her favor. She was allowed to play in the US Open, and she lost her match, her first match in the US Open, to a cis woman. Even though she didn't transition as a young child, she transitioned later in life. So that's an anecdote, but I think it's important to bring up because it's the first time that really transness has been in the Supreme Court. Trans women in most places, in order to compete in any women's sport, must have been on HRT for at least a year and must be in the physical guidelines for the event. AKA, they get a doctor's physical and they know that they're trans and they probably make double fucking sure that they're going to be able to play based on the guidelines. Trans women's bodies are also literally all different, just like every cis woman. There is no one type of trans body, just like there's no one type of cis body. And while testosterone can give someone's body an increase in bone density and muscle mass, once someone goes through HRT, their body is no longer the same as it was. And in most cases, their hormones somewhat decrease their muscle mass and redistribute, their body fat into a more feminine shape. And sports is not about having the strongest bones. Every sport has a different combination of skill, strategy, and strength, and different muscles and speed and agility. To say that a trans woman, any trans woman, is going to be better in all of those areas is fucking stupid. The real fact is that trans women do not dominate women's sports. In fact, think about all the famous women in sports that you know off the top of your head. They're all going to be cis women. I mean, unless you're no sports or you just know trans athletes. I don't think, besides Renee Richards, who I just talked about, I don't think I could name a single trans athlete. Also, think about why this narrative is so popular among right-wingers and TERFs. And why do you never hear a fucking peep about trans men in sports? That's because behind this idea is basically the same as with the trans bathroom bullshit. It's the sentiment that trans women are actually just men in wigs, and trans men are actually just women without titties anymore. I don't know. It also plays this idea that men are stronger than women 100% all the time. And it plays into your inherent transphobia and misogyny, which makes it sound rational because these are ideas that are ingrained into our society. And again, why do we never hear about trans men? It's not that trans men aren't good athletes. It's because if you're saying this in your deepest, darkest recesses of your brain, believe that trans men are just butch women. And sure, let's let them compete with men because they don't pose any real threat to men because they're just women, and women are inherently weaker than men. But when you talk about trans women, you say, well, the trans woman is just a predatory man who's going to defeat every biological woman, and women need to be protected from these predatory men. Do you see why this argument is kind of dog shit? It is literally preying on our society's inherent ingrained beliefs that women are less than and weaker than men, and that we must protect women. And on top of that, you put trans ideology on it. You're just saying in your head, like in the back of your head, well, trans men are just women, so they can compete with men because who gives a shit? They're derogatory women, so who cares? But cis women should be protected from these fake men who just decide that they're women. It's the same shit as the bathroom, you know? Also, there's been a real history of women beating men in sports. It's not just men are always going to be better at every sport than women. That's not true. Let's bring it back to fucking tennis, because tennis is, while it's about your skills, agility, and strength, it's not about who's got the best bones. One thing that really comes to mind is Jean King versus Bobby Riggs, which there's a movie called Battle of the Sexes that was really good. It's also gay, so there you go. Jean King was a 29-year-old tennis player who was challenged to fight Bobby Riggs. Or he challenged any woman. He's like, I can fucking beat any woman at this sport. And she said, beat me, bitch, to Bobby Riggs, who is a 50-year-old tennis player. Basically, she won 3 consecutive matches with him on live television in front of 50 million viewers. That's an example of fucking women beating the shit out of men in sports. So this idea that a trans woman who's also gone through hormone replacement therapy to literally change parts of her biological sex to be the same of cis women, like, it's just fucking funny. Going hand in hand with this idea that cis women are born to be protected and infantilized by men and society and need to be constantly fretted over and taken care of is the topic of detransitioners. AKA think about the children. Okay.
Hello.
This is a topic that's very specific to me personally, because was raised, a girl, and I am now non-binary, masculine. So first, Blaire decides to say,
absolutely never any issues with any child deciding to undergo a medical transition as soon as the law allows them to, and that they're omniscient about their gender.
Okay, girl. The T is children can't transition. Children with permission from their parents, therapists, and doctors can socially transition, 1. 2, they can go on puberty blockers when they're tweens, which are completely safe and irreversible. They literally just temporarily block puberty so that if they wish to transition later on, they can just go on HRT and it'll make their lives better overall. Or they can just go off the puberty blockers and then go through puberty like normally.
Have a normal puberty.
She says, everyone always knows their gender as children.
Like, everyone always knows that as a child.
Okay, let's start off. Blaire herself has said from a young age that she knew she was trans. I myself knew that, well, I didn't know I was trans, technically. I definitely felt like different, and I became aware over time about my own transness. And there have been many, many studies done that show that children, on average, know their gender. Children can't transition anyway, whether or not they know their gender. So,
there you go.
And transition won't be a bad thing. And you should ignore teenage transition stories.
That medical transition won't be a bad thing. And that you have to completely ignore any and all teenage detransition stories.
Like almost the entirety, the vast majority of trans people do not detransition.
Ever.
And in the majority of cases of people who do detransition, it is only temporary. Like the majority of people who detransition is usually due to oppression and bigotry from their communities. Basically, an insignificant amount of people detransition. And while I think it's important that we should listen to people's stories, anyone's stories, including detransitioners, but there is one thing that I will say as a person who has watched a variety of these people's stories and read a few articles by detransitioners, they almost always say that they did not have gender dysphoria, like, ever, and that they just felt like, in general, a disconnect from their femininity, which so many young feminine people just go through because of our society's hatred of femininity.
This is not necessarily the case with all trans people, as some did perceive themselves as having dysphoria and wanting to look like a man, and I do not want to say this about all of the FTMTF people, but many did eventually realize it was something other than gender dysphoria. I've linked to some videos in the description.
That's what I've gathered from them. You can obviously watch and read their stories from themselves. But this doesn't, like I said, this doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to them. But overall, this idea that there's an epidemic of young girls being transed and then regretting it is a lie. And it again is taking a stance that trans men are actually just lost girls who don't know what they're doing and should be protected by society. And it's literally something that I've been told myself from my friends and my family, from mentors and strangers, is that I'm just a girl who doesn't know what's up, basically. And as a child who started saying to other people that I was a gay man in a woman's body at age 10, and I'm now 21, I've been trans the whole time, basically. So, yeah, this is rhetoric that specifically hurts trans masculine people. She says they're just too problematic to hear.
Because those are just, too problematic to hear.
No, Vanessa. In fact, I think it's important that the trans community welcome them, as long as they don't spout anti-transness, obviously. Because I think most trans people can relate in some way to the feeling of not belonging, having dysphoria, and transitioning, and the trauma that comes with that. Because let's be real, being trans is traumatic in some ways. And I think because these people have basically transitioned FTMTF, like double transition, I think that they definitely should have a place in the trans community, whether or not they're identifying as trans, and this goes for anyone, because there's also stories of gay men in the 70s and 80s, because gayness wasn't accepted. It was like the only way that they could be feminine was to transition into women. So there's also this other history of older gay men having detransitioned because we didn't have the same ideas of gender and sex and gender expression and fluidity that we do now. So they were basically forced into this box of, look, if you want to be feminine and like men, then you are basically a woman. And so they transitioned into women and lived their lives as women. And then later on, with all this new ideas of gender and fluidity and expression, they've been able to be like, oh my God, I'm detransitioning because I can actually live my life in society as a flamboyant, feminine gay man. So, all these people should be welcome in the trans community. Vanessa. She says it would be better if the trans community accepted the simple yet way too nuanced reality that some children know their gender and some don't and will regret transitioning.
For the very simple, yet I guess way too nuanced reality, yes, like some children absolutely know when they're that age and they're not going to regret transition, but some children absolutely, that some do regret it.
Like as if she knows what nuanced means, because her whole argument thus far has lacked any sort of nuance. Again, children also can't transition, so there's that for you. She keeps reiterating that the only argument that the trans ideologues, activists, fight for your rights type of crowd has is to ignore that it's happening.
And you're just supposed to ignore that. That's literally the only argument from the trans community.
Vanessa. Girl, okay, I've got a lot of articles to come up here that I'm going to quote from now, so... Quote, are there risks to getting gender-affirming care? Maybe. But are there risks for not getting gender-affirming care? Definitely. And the risks of the latter usually outweigh the former. I think that's a really good point to bring up here. That is it worth hurting literally every other trans person just to maybe, possibly, almost maybe save a few detransitioners? I don't think it is. In a 2015 survey of nearly 28,000 people conducted by the US-based National Center for Transgender Equality, only 8% of respondents reported detransitioning, and 62% of those people said that they only detransitioned temporarily. The most common reason for detransitioning, according to the survey, was pressure from a parent, while only 0.4% of respondents said they detransitioned after realizing transition wasn't right for them. Okay, that's one study. The result of a 50-year study published in 2010 of a cohort of 767 transgender people in Sweden found that about 2% of participants expressed regret after undergoing gender-affirming care over 50 years. 2%, that's like... That's literally 15 people in 50 years out of 767. that detransition. So there we go. The numbers are even lower for non-surgical transition methods like taking puberty blockers, according to a 2018 study of a cohort of transgender young adults at the largest gender identity clinic in the Netherlands. 1.9% of adolescents who started puberty suppressants did not go on to pursue hormone therapy, typically the next step. So that's like literally the reversible process. And that's even less people don't go on to HRT after that. Studies. I'm going to keep going. And I'm going to have all the links in the description. So if you want to check these out for yourself, you totally can. A research analysis showed that of the 3,398 trans patients who had appointments at an NHS gender identity service between 2016 and 2017, less than 1% in those appointments said that they had experienced transition-related regret or had detransitioned. However, just because people have detransitioned doesn't make the experience of an existence of trans people any less valid or real. So that's basically 4 different studies that have shown that a very minute amount of people have detransitioned over different periods of time and different places. That seems pretty conclusive to me. Here she basically is now saying that we need more medical gatekeeping to make sure people don't accidentally transition.
Digestible solution is just to say, let's work together to really raise the bar for criteria of how people are diagnosed with gender dysphoria so that we can definitely minimize the chances of people having this regret.
So medical gatekeeping is a big deal. Along with the fact that in America, healthcare is not accessible. The process is already very intense, and there are so many hurdles to jump through in terms of getting a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, as Blaire says. And the fact is that informed consent for trans adults not only actually saves lives, but it cuts down on anxiety and stress, financial barriers, and ensures that trans people get the care that they need. And they aren't turned away because a doctor or therapist does not deem them trans enough, which is a real problem that was happening in the 80s and 90s and 70s, would be trans women going into clinics and the doctors just deciding they weren't trans enough, they weren't feminine enough, they didn't put on their mommy's dresses at a young enough age to go on HRT. So medical gatekeeping didn't even save these transitioners from transitioning. Like, I read them and watched the videos, and it sounded like many of them did go through therapists and doctors to get their hormones. So why would we put more obstacles in the way of actual trans people just to save, quote unquote, an extreme minority of, quote unquote, young girls? If an 18-year-old can enlist and die in the military, why can't one accidentally lower their voice and grow some facial hair? I'm just saying, not to downplay their struggles, because obviously there are real struggles and trauma, but trans women raise their voice all the time, and you can shave. So I'm going to link another article down here about medical gatekeeping being basically a staple of trans experience for like the history of transness, and how people are very desperate to transition and what lengths that they'll go to because they're let down by the system of medical gatekeeping. So also, this is why there's such a big problem with self-medication in the trans community, especially leading up to this new era of like trans awareness, but doesn't exclude it, is trans people like getting hormones by themselves without doctors because they have so many barriers between them and getting hormones that they would just rather self-medicate, which is not safe, and I don't recommend anyone do that. But that just shows like the lengths that people go to, the desperation that you go through as a trans person. Now that we're done with that whole section of sports and detransitioning and all that, my next section is Blaire and the
Demon Snowflake Trans Activists.
After all of this talk of anti-trans bigotry, I'm sure that you're ready to talk about something fun and positive. And while we might find some brevity in this section, overall we're still going to be talking about Blaire and her
nasty lies and hyperboles.
And lack of evidence.
Of course.
She says, we seek to deconstruct society rather than to fit into society.
They seek to deconstruct society, and they do not want trans people to assimilate into society.
Okay, so here's my beef with this. Basically, society has major flaws, and over time those flaws should be corrected. So assimilation is bad. We covered that. And society needs to change, because the way that we talk about gender and biological sex is inherently flawed. While we have recently been able to make the distinction between sex and gender, i.e. gender is the social construct that is who we are in society, and sex is this quote-unquote unchangeable binary biology that is inherent also to every person. Not to say that that's not true in some ways. So it's good that we've made the distinction, at least, between the societal roles and ideas and expressions of gender and sex. So back to her initial statement. The reason that trans people are hated so much is because we seek to break down society and not fit into it. Well, the thing that she's not getting, Vanessa, is the fact that we live in a society that was built on the foundations of patriarchal white supremacy, or the idea that if you aren't a white, cishet, Christian, able-bodied, landowning, masculine man, that you are less than and you have less worth and you don't deserve as many rights or any rights. Now, obviously, over time, we have been able to get more rights and freedoms for other people that don't fit into that. So when it comes to specifically talking about gender expression, biological sex, how all of this fit into society, you have to start at the very beginning, right? When the colonizers came over into America, they were demonizing Native Americans and Black people. And the way that they did that was to attack their culture. And one thing that they did was point out how a lot of these cultures have third genders and gender nonconformity intertwined with them. And because that the white people decided that there were only two sexes, male and female, and there were very specific rigid rules to put in place that somehow they were more civilized. And in order to assimilate the Black and Indigenous people, they had to relinquish their own societal beliefs and conform to the white people's stupid bullshit. So now, hundreds of years later, these actions and ideals have withstood the test of time, and we are only now finally starting to question these ideas, and science is backing us up. It's right there with us. Not only do we know that gender and gender expression and gender roles are all made up societal bullshit, but we also know that biological sex is not some binary, rigid thing. Sex is a spectrum of characteristics, including chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, and external genitalia. Most people do fall into a specific combination of these things, i.e. what we typically call male and female, but there are plenty of people who do not fall exactly into these categories. Because biological sex isn't just black and white, and it's actually just a jumble of characteristics, like I mentioned, not only can you technically obviously change your gender because it's societal, but I mean,
you can technically change your sex.
You can alter your sex. If I take hormones and I get surgeries to remove my internal organs and get surgery to change my physical tissue, my sex is no longer one thing. You can literally change your biological characteristics. And while you don't have to do any of this to be trans is just about gender. A lot of trans people do. I just wanted to explain that, like, technically you can change your sex. It's just a mess of a few different little factors. And if you can change some of those factors, that's basically just changing aspects of your sex and your biology. So now, if you want to talk about these ideas and how it would break down society, I want to say that I do not expect every person to hold these ideas. And you don't technically need to believe all of this to believe that trans people are real and valid and they deserve rights. And in some ways, this is breaking down society's ideas. But the truth that I believe is that while it takes time to change society's beliefs, some amount of change is required for trans people to be fully accepted and to have rights. Back when America was started, society believed that women were dumb, weak sex objects and that Black people should literally be slaves and disabled people should be hidden out of sight or fucking killed. And we have fundamentally changed many of these views for most of society. And while any beliefs that society has now have to stem from how it was when we were created, hence why there is still a gender wage gap, why Black people are still incarcerated at an astronomical rate, and why disabled people still basically have no rights or bodily autonomy in the law, we have come a long way. And these beliefs are continuously being changed and challenged. And while trans people have not been in the conversation for very long, we have been making strides in breaking down society's ideas about what gender is, and we should continue to push these ideas and conversations if we're going to continue to gain acceptance. Hopefully that all made sense, Vanessa. Then she says,
trans ideology and trans activists who use that ideology to gain acceptance, and that's, their alleged goal.
Miss Ma'am, do you mean to tell me that you think that literal trans people who are literally fighting for other trans people's rights do not want to get social acceptance for themselves and other trans people? Their alleged goal?
Jesus Christ, Vanessa.
Vanessa talks about like random tweets and never actually brings up any specific activists or ideologies. She's just being very vague in this whole video, really. She talks about the definition of trans, which is apparently being born one biological sex but living as another.
Which is being born a biological sex and transitioning and living your life as another.
And she says that it's pretty easy to like understand this person was born a boy but now looks like a girl and goes by she.
That like, oh, that person was like born a boy but like looks like a girl now and, you know, goes by she. Like,
okay, Vanessa. So this is actually really, I think, reductive of what being trans actually is, for every trans person anyway. To be transgender, the criteria that you need to meet is that you were assigned a gender at birth, basically boy or girl, male or female, and now you realize you're a different gender than that. You don't have to go from one biological construct to another biological construct. It's literally just about being a different gender than the doctor assigned you when you were born. Also, personally, I think it sounds a lot worse to say a trans person is a biological something, like who dresses and acts like a biological something else. And while some people, like Vanessa, may identify with that idea of what trans is and who they are, which is totally fine, every trans person, for the most part, I think, has a different idea of like what their transness and gender and sex all means to them and how it all comes together. I think it's fine to identify with that idea and feel that. But to say that that is what every transgender person should be or should feel is really negating the fact that for a lot of trans people, that would negate the fact that they are the gender that they say they are, and that they aren't just dressing up and putting on a little show or performance, and that they aren't lying, that they really are who they say they are. Because there is a real social history of this idea that trans people lie and they cheat. They're lying to you. I don't think that's what Vanessa meant to say, but that's what that implies.
That also negates the experience of non-binary individuals who do not go from some A point to the B point, like myself. And while some non-binary people do undergo medical transition, that doesn't make us any less or more trans. And it doesn't mean we necessarily mean we are trying to pass for another sex.
She says, born in the wrong body is a narrative that we spent decades trying to build.
and it's also a narrative that transgender people spent decades trying to build.
The thing here is that while this was a formative narrative for the transgender community, it's also an outdated one. Terminology has been constantly evolving since especially Stonewall, when many trans people were called drag queens and transvestites still, and then later on adopted the term transsexual. The one way that trans people were previously able to relate to cis people and to cis doctors was to say they were born in the wrong body. And because this was the criteria that cis doctors used to decide whether a person actually deserved or needed a medical transition, was that they literally wished they were born a cis person, and that they were like, ooh, I dressed up in my mommy's makeup and high heels when I was little and I always knew I was meant to be a woman. And if they were not convinced, or they could not convince a doctor, then they would never be able to transition and they would live a short and miserable life. This narrative is now so ingrained in transness that many trans people still use this either as a narrative to come out as trans, or for many people like Vanessa, they still hold on to it as a primary way that they feel. And while that is obviously a valid way to see and understand your identity, it is not that way for many trans people now, including myself. The point is that being born in the wrong body was a useful analogy in getting trans issues to be seen and heard by doctors and by cis people, but in 2021, it is a relic of the days of medical gatekeeping by cis doctors and trying to suck up to cis people to convince them that we are who we say we are. So that's my opinion on that. Blaire says that trans activists are ripping down Born in the Wrong Body, saying that you have to believe that trans women are biological women, and if you don't, you're a fucking bigot.
And now a lot of trans activists are coming along and completely ripping that down and saying, no, actually, if you don't believe that transgender women are biological women, then you're a bigot.
So first, that's a bit dramatic, Vanessa. Why are you painting trans activists as science-denying snowflakes who call everyone who disagrees with them a bigot? This is a philosophical and social conversation conversation that a lot of these trans activists, quote unquote, are having, along with the talks about changing laws and advocating for trans people. Also, my thought is, if the way that people are currently talking about us as trans people is that saying we'll never actually be trans because you can't change your chromosomes, and people like Benny Shaps saying that biology is the nature of the pronoun, chromosomes are pronouns. Like, I feel like the logical next step for trans people to take is just to say, well, fuck you, I am biologically trans. I'm biologically what I say I am. My brain is my biology, and even though some asshole doctor saw my genitalia and said, it's a boy or it's a girl, he was wrong to assume that, and I am a fucking woman, or I'm a fucking man, or I'm a fucking genderqueer. Also, I can literally take hormones and get surgeries and socially transition, and you cannot tell me that I'm not biologically what I say I am. I think that that's a fair argument, and Vanessa is trying to paint this argument as something irrational and dumb. Honestly, if you're not a grifter, I think you can understand this argument and where it comes from, and if you can begin to understand it, hopefully you will eventually agree with it in some way. She says
the equivalent would be the gay community saying, no, two men can have a child together without a woman, therefore we should be able to adopt.
So, Vanessa,
What the fuck?
are you talking about? Like, seriously, this is the biggest false equivalence. There is a real biological and social element to being transgender. It is not crazy to call being trans biological, and trans people still deserve easy access to gender affirming medical care and right. While the other argument is made up nonsense. Two men should just be able to adopt because they are two capable adult humans, just like any other adult humans. Also, technically, two men can have a baby without a woman if one of them is transgender, which has happened before. So maybe shut the fuck up, Vanessa, on this one. This is facts and logic for you guys, by the way. This is the same kind of shit that like Ben Shapiro likes to say and then say, I only rely on facts and logic. So then she reads a tweet that says,
the notion of biological sex was developed for the exclusive purpose of being weaponized against people.
And then just says, how?
How?
And then moves on. Okay, well, biological sex is based on a real phenomenon, real characteristics. It really was utilized as a weapon against indigenous and non-Western cultures because basically all of Europe colonized the rest of the world and forced assimilation. The idea that there were only two genders and sexes and that there were rigid rules that came with each of these was used to suppress and eradicate those cultures. As well as when the idea of two sexes originally came about, that was used as proof that women were less than and men were superior to women. Inherently, there's a weaker sex. So use your critical thinking skills and also Google. And apparently there's a self-defeating cycle that trans activists go through when we say something and then all the people in the world get shocked and we don't learn from it and we keep doing it.
It's such a self-defeating perpetual cycle.
Honestly, Vanessa, I think the shit that's worse is people like you who at one point had over 1 million subscribers and also millions of views on your videos, actively bullying trans people, telling lies about transphobia, exposing trans predators. Not to say that they're not predators, but you seem to highlight trans predators a lot, telling hyperboles about detransitioners, continuously demonizing other trans women for literally just being themselves and for playing sports. All of this to a massive audience of presumably cis people, and then saying that trans activists are actually the ones perpetuating harm and hurting the community, and then wondering why people's hate and violence against trans people is becoming increased. Wouldn't you say that that's more of a self-defeating cycle? That people have been constantly calling you out for your hate and manipulation, and that you always apologize but then you never reflect on it?
To see yourself and not recognize your face.
Vanessa, do you have an ounce of self-awareness in you? Can you admit that you are a conservative talking head and that you care more about what cis-het white men think of you than the actual subjugation of your own community? Okay. She says, if you have to ignore certain realities to make your arguments work.
If you have to actively ignore certain realities to make your argument work.
Nope, Vanessa. The only one doing that is you. Actively ignoring the fact that being trans is not a medical disorder, gender and rigid binary sex are social constructs, that non-binary people exist and are trans, that teenage detransitioners is not the big story that you think it is, and this all perpetuates harmful ideas about trans people while you lie to make your points. Like, should I keep going about ignoring realities? She says, if the goal is acceptance, why isn't it working?
To acceptance, which should be the goal. If that's the goal, then why is this not working?
Why in most people's trans experience I know, there's more anti-trans violence?
Why are there, in my experience, in most trans people's experience I know, more anti-trans people now than ever?
So think about earlier, the acceptance rate.
Hold on, pause this shit.
Okay, and how before you were born and I was born, we didn't have any rights, basically? Okay, so think about that for a second. Also, think about the fact that you, Vanessa, voted for a man, Donald Trump, who not only expressed violence and hateful rhetoric against queer people, but literally every other community of marginalized people. And that with his rise in prominence, there was a normalization of right-wing extremist violence against minorities and outspoken hate against minorities, including trans people. Maybe think about that for a second and think again about all of your content that is about how trans people can't be in sports, trans predators are everywhere, detransitioners lying about trans people's identities, a video where you downplay the effects that Trump had on the trans community while calling other trans people delusional, defending TERF ideology, etc., etc. Don't you think that someone watching your content as their only representation of trans people might start to have a negative and twisted view about trans people? That we are all more likely to be predators, delusional, liars, and unreasonable? That's all the things that's perpetuated in your content, Vanessa, so...
Think about it.
She says there are real issues like housing discrimination and job discrimination.
Because I think there are issues like employment discrimination, housing discrimination, that are really big issues, and I think that's so sad.
She's right. But then, Vanessa, if there is, why don't you talk about it? Why do you not have a single video where you talk about the ways in which we're all oppressed? Here are some petitions. Here's how you can stay educated. Why didn't you mention the fact that the Equality Act is a big step in ending housing discrimination and job discrimination? She hasn't said a single word about it. Despite literally days before the Equality Act was passed in the House, she made a video about why the trans community is oppressed and doesn't have acceptance. Well, there's literally a bill that had just gotten passed that will, in some ways, end a lot of the trans and queer discrimination and all these things. Just ask her that. Vanessa, why not? Okay? She says,
don't like seeing trans people demolish women in women's sports. It provokes a visceral reaction to protect those women. And if trans people want to go against that reaction, you're never going to win. That's so instinctual, that's so animalistic, and it's also healthy for a society.
So when Ben Shapiro, this is a real thing, Ben Shapiro calls you he just because you have an XY chromosome, have you ever thought about just not having one? No. You haven't, because that's not your fault that you're not fitting up to his standards. That's his fault. If a person sees me on the street and calls me an F slur and spits on me, that's not because of anything that I did, okay? That's that person's problem. Trans people are not at fault for how society treats us ever, okay? And I cannot even believe that you would begin to make that argument. Okay, so it's a woman's fault for winning one sport game out of however many. And when someone sees her win a sport game, they have an initial gut disgust reaction to that person and also have another reaction to want to protect all the other adult grown women from participating in the sport that they decided to pursue as an adult. Make that make sense, Vanessa? Do you think that racists are entitled to their disgust reaction of other races? Do you think that evangelical homophobes are entitled to their disgust reaction of gay people, and that it's mostly their fault that other people have the disgust reaction to hate and despise them? That is fucked up. And maybe it's healthy to have a societal disgust reaction when it's something like pedophiles, but not to normal people who aren't hurting anyone and are just trying to survive and be happy. That is, I think, disgusting that you would even try to make that argument, first of all. Anyway, let's go to the next section. The real life effects to Blaire. So now that we've covered all of the issues in this video that Vanessa likes to lie about to everyone, let's get into the heart of this video of hers. The whole video and all of the topics that she brings up in this video is all to tell you that the real reason the trans community is not accepted in society and is marginalized and is oppressed is not the hundreds of years of racist, misogynistic, puritanical rhetoric that our nation was founded on, and that being transgender inherently challenges. It is actually because of leftist, transgender so-called activists and their science-denying faux revolution against the normal people. Yes, that's right. Trans people who fight for our rights and try to shift culture to accept and include us. These are the reasons that trans people are murdered and harassed and oppressed. That's what she wants you to get through to you in this video. Blaire talks about how the trans community will never gain full acceptance. She says, I've noticed an uptick in anti-trans violence. The trans approval rating is what I'm going to call it in this video, is what I've been calling it, are continuously climbing, despite there being more vocal hate, which I will tie directly to the rise of right-wing extremism and the normalization of violence. There's been a 20% uptick in anti-trans violence from 2018 to 2019, despite the also uptick in acceptance of trans people and trans issues. Anti-LGBT hate groups rose 43% from 2018 to 2019. The Southern Poverty Law Center, this report says that the surge was, quote, possibly fueled by continued anti-LGBT sentiment and policy emanating from government officials, largely attributing it to the Trump administration. Anti-LGBT hate groups have become intertwined with the Trump administration, and after years of civil rights progress and growing acceptance among the broader American public, anti-LGBTQ sentiment within the Republican Party is rising. Though Trump promised during his campaign to be a real friend to the LGBTQ community, he has fully embraced anti-LGBT hate groups and their agenda of dismantling federal protections and resources for LGBTQ people. Now, in Blaire's own view, she goes on to explain how she believes that this violence is in direct correlation with the trans activists and trans ideology. But if you look at the rise in right-wing extremism in America with former President Donald Trump, for all demographics, it's on the rise. You might also have heard say about a specific English gal named Joanne, and well, Vanessa has claimed on multiple occasions that Joanne is a non-hateful woman who believes that biology is real. You might have also heard how she said quite a lot more than that, and that her outspokenness has had a direct impact on Turf Island and the culture surrounding trans issues and the actual laws in Britain. A senator from my own state of Oklahoma quoted Joanne in her essay while he helped block the vote on the formerly mentioned Equality Act in June of last year. And not to mention, while I was writing this, Alabama banned any and all medical treatment for trans people under the age of 19. Which, don't forget, Vanessa doesn't give a fuck about anyway, because she was 20 when she started transitioning, and she doesn't even live in Alabama, so it doesn't even affect her. She's not mentioned it once. At least there will be no more new transitioners in Alabama, right?
And that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, cool. So, in conclusion, Vanessa is a liar and manipulator who literally blames other trans people for the hate and violence that is perpetuated against our community. I hope that I was able to provide enough of a basis and context to tell you why she is wrong in a grifter whose alleged goal of getting trans people accepted in society seems to rely on the assumption that she's the only type of trans who deserves rights or respect and everyone else can choke, apparently. But seriously, Vanessa's rhetoric is arguably way more toxic because she's, after all, a trans woman. And so as long as the words come out of her mouth, it's not transphobic, and anything she says about trans people can be taken at face value, which I'm sorry, Vanessa, but that isn't true in the slightest. And while you like to say that you're not transphobic, the internalized transphobia is rampant, running rampant in your videos. I hope you're able to watch this video because it's important that we start to try and speak out more against people like Vanessa who do nothing good for our community, except for that one time that she tried to tell Benny Shaps that she uses she, her pronouns, and he literally told her no and continued to misgender her. So good work, Vanessa. Maybe next time don't be such a trender.
Please like and subscribe and obliterate that bell.